Welcome to Mission Ready, a professional development series built to strengthen how organizations lead, communicate, and perform. Each session translates real-world leadership lessons into practical tools any team can use, whether you're driving strategy, managing people, or building your career. The focus is simple: clarity, discipline, and consistent execution. This isn't about where you come from. It's about equipping you to operate with confidence in fast-moving environments. Whatever your role, this is your space to refine your craft and get mission ready. In this episode, we're going to pull back the curtain on one of the most misunderstood forces shaping the U.S. economy, the supply chain. Most people think supply chains are just shipping or transportation, but in reality, they're global systems of coordination, logistics, timing, capacity, and risk. When they work, prices stay low and goods feel abundant. When they break, even at a single point, the effects ripple across everything we buy. In this lesson, we're going to explore how supply chains function, what actually determines prices, and why disruptions, anywhere in the world, show up in the average American's grocery bill, rent payment, and cost of living. If you're a leader, these forces matter. Supply chains determine readiness, opportunity, stability, and the operational environment your people live and work in. Understanding them isn't economics, it's leadership. When most people hear the word supply chain, they picture trucks, ships, or warehouses. But a supply chain is actually an entire system, a sequence of dependent links that must work in perfect coordination. It begins with raw materials pulled out of the ground, continues through manufacturing plants and assembly lines, and then moves through ports, freight networks, rail hubs, fulfillment centers, and retail operations. Each stage adds cost, time, and potential failure points. Economists emphasize this because price isn't determined simply by supply and demand. Price reflects the friction inside this chain, the distance materials must travel, the number of hands they pass through, and the amount of risk embedded at every step. When one link breaks, the entire system slows or collapses. That's why supply chain literacy is not just for economists. It's part of understanding the modern operating environment for business, government, and national readiness. A modern product isn't built in one place. It's assembled from components sourced across multiple countries, each specializing in different parts. The average smartphone contains materials from Africa, chips from Taiwan, sensors from Japan, software from the United States, and assembly in China or Vietnam. A single delay in any of those layers, a port shutdown, a factory fire, a political conflict, or a raw material shortage, halts the entire system. This is why prices can rise quickly when supply chains are disrupted. It's not the cost of the finished product that moves, it's the cost of every layer underneath it. Global specialization lowers prices because each region becomes highly efficient at its specific role. But it also creates fragility. Leaders must understand these hidden layers because small shocks can create outsized consequences in the real world their teams operate. Once a product is manufactured, it enters the logistics pipeline, the long sequence of movements that brings an item from a factory to a person's hands. This pipeline includes trucking, ports, container yards, ocean shipping, customs, rail lines, warehouses, and last-mile delivery. Each one introduces costs, timing, and risk. What leaders often miss is that delays compound. A 6-hour port delay becomes a missed rail connection. That missed rail connection becomes a 4-day warehouse backlog. That backlog raises costs, reduces availability, and eventually hits the consumer as higher prices. The logistics pipeline is responsible for over half of the total cost structure for many goods. When it's efficient, prices stay stable. When it breaks down, prices shoot up. Not because of greed or politics, but because time, distance, and risk became more expensive. Understanding this pipeline is essential for any leader trying to interpret price movement or anticipate operational challenges. One of the most important concepts in supply chains is lead time, the total time required for goods to move from one stage to another. Longer lead times create uncertainty. Uncertainty forces companies to build safety stock, increase warehouse space, and tie up cash in inventory that isn't being used yet. Every extra day in the pipeline has a financial cost. It increases the risk of shortages, price volatility, and lost sales. And because delays compound, a small disruption in one layer can push the entire system out of sync. This is why prices rise during supply chain breakdowns. It is not just the cost of materials, it's the cost of uncertainty, additional inventory, longer wait times, and the financial strain of keeping the pipeline stable. Leaders must understand lead time because it silently shapes price, availability, and overall economic stability. If you want to understand sudden price spikes, you must understand bottlenecks. Most major supply chain crises do not come from shortages. They come from choke points that slow or stop the entire system. Choke points are physical or logistical locations where a large percentage of global trade must pass. Canals, ports, rail hubs, tunnels, straits, and manufacturing clusters. When a single choke point becomes congested, damaged, or disrupted, the effects ripple across continents. The 2021 Suez Canal blockage cost the global economy nearly $10 billion per day. West Coast port congestion drove a surge in U.S. consumer prices. The Panama Canal drought forced ships to reroute thousands of extra miles, raising freight rates and delivery times. These events are not rare accidents. They are predictable consequences of systems operating at or near maximum capacity. Leaders must be aware of where these choke points exist and how quickly disruptions can cascade into higher prices. Most supply chain breakdowns aren't caused by factory shortages. They're caused by people. Ports, warehouses, rail yards, trucking companies, and distribution centers rely on skilled labor operating at steady throughput. When labor is short, tired, overworked, or disrupted by strikes or illness, the entire system slows. The second factor is capacity, the number of containers, trailers, trucks, chassis, forklifts, and loading bays available at any given moment. When demand rises faster than capacity, delays compound and prices increase. This is exactly what happened during the 2020 to 2022 surge, when container shortages and driver shortages collided with record e-commerce demand. What leaders must understand is this: the system is fragile not because it is poorly designed, but because it operates with very little slack. A shortage of dock workers in Los Angeles affects inventory in Kansas City. A shortage of truck drivers in Chicago affects grocery prices in Atlanta. Labor and capacity are the heartbeat of the supply chain. When they fail, everything else fails with them. The next hidden force behind price increases is fuel, freight, and risk premiums. Every mile a product travels adds cost, and that cost depends heavily on fuel prices. When oil becomes expensive, ocean shipping, trucking, and air freight all become more costly, and those increases show up in the final price of everything from food to electronics. Freight rates also rise when capacity is limited. During 2021, a shortage of containers and port congestion caused the cost of shipping a single container from China to the United States to spike by more than tenfold. Risk premiums add another layer. If a route becomes dangerous because of piracy, war, geopolitical tension, or weather instability, insurance rates increase. Ships may need to reroute thousands of extra miles to avoid conflict zones or environmental restrictions, raising costs further. These forces compound. Fuel affects freight affects risk affects insurance, and all of it eventually reaches the consumer. Understanding these dynamics helps leaders interpret price changes with clarity instead of confusion. Let's look at what supply chain failure actually looks like in the real world, because none of these pressures stay inside the economy. They spill directly into the lives of the people we lead. The first example is the 2021 semiconductor shortage. One missing component, microchips, halted production in automotive, electronics, and medical device manufacturing. A penny-sized part froze billions of dollars in output. This is classic upstream dependency risk. When one upstream node collapses, every downstream industry collapses with it. Second, we saw the Port of LA/Long Beach backlog. Labor shortages, inland warehouse congestion, and chassis scarcity created a gridlock so severe that ships waited weeks offshore. Retail inventories collapsed, delivery windows fell apart, and prices surged. This shows how logistics capacity, not product availability, becomes the real choke point. And finally, we have the global spike in container prices. Shipping a 40-foot container from Shanghai to LA went from $1,500 to over $20,000 almost overnight. That cost did not get absorbed by corporations. It was passed forward in the form of higher consumer prices. The lesson for leaders is simple. Supply chains fail the same way missions fail, not because of one catastrophic event, but because multiple small weaknesses align at the same time. When we understand those weak points, we don't just understand the economy better, we become better leaders. This is the most important concept in supply chains, the bullwhip effect. It explains why small, harmless changes in consumer demand turn into major disruptions upstream in manufacturing, inventory, and logistics. When consumers buy slightly more of a product, whether toilet paper in 2020, cars in 2021, or home appliances, retailers overreact. They place larger orders to protect themselves. Wholesalers then increase their orders to protect themselves. Manufacturers increase production even more. A small shift at the consumer level turns into massive volatility at the factory level. That volatility creates shortages, overproduction, inventory waste, and ultimately higher prices. The leadership lesson is simple. Volatility is expensive. Stability is cheap. The goal is not perfect demand forecasting, but smooth, predictable demand patterns. Leaders who understand the bullwhip effect avoid panic decisions and help their teams stay steady when the system becomes unstable. When prices shift suddenly, it's rarely because of simple supply or demand. It's caused by mechanical pressure inside the supply chain. When inventory depletes, companies place rush orders. Rush orders trigger overtime labor, premium wages, and expensive workarounds. When shipping lanes tighten, companies switch from ocean freight to air freight, the most costly mode available. If demand continues, manufacturers hit reorder lag. They simply cannot ramp up production fast enough. The final stage is lost sales, where consumers are willing to pay more just to get the product. This is why prices can jump 10%, 20%, even 50% in a short window. These cost pressures are real, mechanical, and unavoidable. And leaders who understand these mechanisms can anticipate price volatility before it hits their teams or their mission. Every supply chain reflects a leadership choice between vulnerability and resilience. Vulnerability is cheaper, at least on paper. It means single source suppliers, minimal inventory, offshoring, and prioritizing the lowest possible cost. But resilience costs money. It requires redundancy, buffer inventory, multi-sourcing, nearshoring, and operational slack. All of these look expensive until a disruption hits. When the system breaks, vulnerability becomes the most expensive strategy of all. Strong leaders understand this trade-off. They don't optimize purely for cost. They optimize for continuity. Resilience is a strategic investment, not a luxury. To lead effectively in a global economy, you need to understand America's strategic weak points, Not for political arguments, but for realistic planning. Our pharmaceutical supply chain depends heavily on China and India. The most advanced microchips, essential for weapon systems, vehicles, electronics, and communications, rely almost entirely on Taiwan. Rare earth minerals used in batteries, sensors, aircraft, and targeting systems are dominated by China. Our energy infrastructure still runs through key choke points, where a single disruption can cascade across entire regions. And finally, our food system remains vulnerable to weather volatility, droughts, and environmental stress. These weak points shape prices, availability, and national readiness. Leaders who understand them aren't caught off guard. They prepare their teams before disruption hits. Price isn't just a number, it is a signal, an indicator of stress somewhere inside the supply chain. When prices move suddenly, something in the system is under pressure. Strong leaders don't just react to higher prices, they decode them. They ask the right questions. Where is the bottleneck? What risk premium is being added because of instability, fuel, insurance, or conflict? What dependency is being exposed? A single supplier, a single region, or a single input? How long will lead times remain elevated? Most importantly, is this a demand spike or a supply collapse? Those two situations require completely different responses. Leaders who understand price as a signal gain a strategic advantage. They can anticipate stress before it reaches their teams. If there's one thing I want you to take from this session, it's this. Prices follow logistics, not politics. When we understand the movement of goods, we understand the movement of prices. Second, global stability is determined by choke points. The world does not move evenly. It moves through narrow, fragile passages. Third, lead times and inventory are the hidden cost drivers behind every industry. When they stretch, everything becomes expensive. Fourth, the bullwhip effect is the invisible enemy. Small changes become large shocks, and leaders must recognize that cycle early. And finally, strong leaders anticipate bottlenecks. They don't wait for headlines to tell them something has gone wrong. When you understand supply chains, you understand the economic terrain your people operate in. That understanding makes you a more informed, more resilient, and more effective leader. This episode of Mission Ready was led by Sean Havens. Remember, leadership isn't just about the decisions you make, but the understanding behind them. The strongest leaders are the quiet analysts, the ones who see the system before the system breaks. Stay sharp, stay disciplined, and stay mission ready.